A quiet Arizona roadside is torn by the crunch of shattered glass and the screech of metal twisting under pressure. A police cruiser idles just behind a classic, meticulously kept pickup, now mangled. The windshield is shattered, both tires slashed on the driver's side, and the rear bumper dangles like a broken limb. The badge number on the cruiser is visible, but the face behind the wheel is anything but calm. The young officer steps out, chest heaving, lips tight with something between pride and panic. His knuckles are red, so is a crowbar in his hand. A bell jingles as the door to the roadside diner opens. Out steps an older man. Weathered face, faded jeans, calm as desert stone. He doesn't run, doesn't shout, just watches. The crowd outside, a handful of locals and passers-by, begins to murmur. One man in a bowl cap leans to another and whispers, "That's his truck." The camera lingers on the officer's face, suddenly unsure. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Comment below. 2 days earlier, the truck was still whole. It rolled into the town of Veilstone just past 10 a.m., a rust-colored stretch of desert where the roads buckle in the summer heat and even the crows seem to keep their opinions to themselves. The kind of place where no one says hello first, and every man watches a rearview mirror a second longer than he should. Chuck Norris stepped out of the truck in slow, measured movements. Not out of frailty, but reverence. He had driven nearly 5 hours through the desert to get here, stopping for nothing but fuel and silence. This was a personal trip, and personal things didn't need to be rushed. He parked beneath a shade tree near the only diner for 40 miles. A pale blue building with cracked siding, one flapping screen door, and a sign that once said roses, but now just read Roz __ in sun-bleached letters. Inside, the diner smelled like coffee, onions, and something older, like history kept in a warm drawer. He took the corner booth, his back to the wall, facing the door. It was a habit that never left him, no matter how many years passed. The waitress, a thin woman in her 60s with a name tag that said June, approached cautiously. "You passing through?" she asked, pouring in black coffee without waiting for the answer. Chuck gave a polite nod. "Just visiting a friend." She hesitated. "Cemetery's up the ridge." "I know," Chuck said, gently. June squinted at him, as if placing a nearly forgotten memory. "You got one of those faces. Familiar, but quiet." Chuck smiled faintly. "Been told was." Across the room, a few locals watched from behind newspapers and half-eaten breakfasts. None of them greeted him. They weren't unfriendly, just cautious. Small towns have long memories, and even longer silences. That's when the patrol car cruised by the front window. Its engine didn't roar. It loitered, crawled, like it was sniffing for something. Behind the wheel was Officer Brent Holloway, 28, lean, proud, and always just a few ticks more aggressive than necessary. The kind of cop who asks questions already shaped like accusations. He locked eyes on the old pickup through the glass. Didn't blink. June saw it too. Her smile vanished. "You might want to keep your visit short," she said, almost kindly. "He don't like trucks with out-of-state plates, especially ones with decorated plates." Chuck didn't reply. He just folded the photo in his wallet open. 2 young men in uniform, arms around each other, desert sun behind them. One was Chuck. The other was Private First Class Darrell Holt, buried less than a mile up the ridge. As a patrol car passed, the diner's chatter grew quieter. Not out of fear, but fatigue. They'd seen things like this before. Not with Chuck, but with others who didn't fit the mold. The kind of people who got questioned twice or followed home for rolling stops. No one ever said the words, but everyone knew. Chuck finished his coffee, left a $20 bill under the mug, and stepped out into the sun. The officer was already parked down the street, watching, engine idling, thumb resting on his radio MIC like a tick. Chuck looked toward the ridge. It was just another few hours to say goodbye to an old friend. But Veilstone had other plans. The next morning, the sky cracked open with heat before 9 a.m. Chuck had already returned from the cemetery. He didn't linger there, just stood in front of Darrell's headstone with his hat in his hands and a silence that said more than eulogies ever could. He spoke once, 4 words, and only the dirt heard them. Back in town, Chuck parked his truck in the exact same spot beneath the shade tree outside the diner. He hadn't finished his breakfast the day before. Something about leaving things unfinished felt wrong. But the shade wasn't what it used to be. Officer Holloway was already on the street. This time, standing beside his cruiser, arms crossed, sunglasses on, watching. He didn't move when Chuck walked past him, didn't speak. Just let the silence turn thick and personal. Inside, June was already filling a cup before Chuck sat down. "I'd offer you the pie again," she said softly, "but I got a feeling we're about to lose our appetite." Chuck looked up. The officer had moved closer, now standing by the driver's side door of the truck, inspecting it like a predator sizing up its prey. He leaned in, knocked on the side panel, glanced at the decals, a Marine emblem, a small POW MIA sticker, and the old Arizona veteran plate with 5 digits and a gold star. Holloway pulled out his radio and called something in. Chuck heard just a few clipped words. Possible narcotics, suspicious plate, may need to impound. June sighed. "That boy came back from academy full of fire, nowhere to burn it," she muttered. "Likes to flex, especially when there's no one to stop him." Chuck kept his eyes on the window. Calm. Still. Outside, Holloway circled the truck once more. Then, with deliberate disrespect, he opened the driver's door without a warrant. Chuck's keys were still in his pocket. The officer had used a tool, standard issue for breaking into locked cars. He rifled through the glove box, pulled out a folded paper, an old insurance document, and inspected a photo taped to the dashboard. Chuck's younger self again, in uniform, this time with a woman and child standing beside him. Holloway tore it off the dash and let it fall to the floor. That was when Chuck stood. He didn't raise his voice, didn't even frown, just stepped outside like he was going to check the weather. Locals began to gather. One man from the auto shop, a teenager on a bicycle, a couple heading into the diner who turned around and stayed. "What's going on here?" Chuck asked plainly. Holloway turned toward him, resting one hand on his holstered sidearm, the other still gripping the crowbar he used to inspect vehicles. "This your truck?" "It is." "Then you won't mind me taking a closer look." "I do mind." The officer smiled tightly. "Well, then we have a problem." Chuck looked at the shattered photo now lying face down on the pavement. "You're damaging private property," Chuck said, voice even, "without cause, without consent, and without respect." Holloway stepped closer. "You think respect's something you get automatically?" "No," Chuck replied. "I think it's something you lose the moment you forget who you work for." A phone camera clicked. Then another. One of the bystanders, a teenager holding an iced tea, asked out loud, "Why is he wrecking the old man's truck?" Another followed. "Ain't this profiling or something?" Holloway's ears turned red, but his hand stayed steady. "You need to leave, sir," he said. "This vehicle is under investigation." Chuck didn't move. "Then arrest me," he said, flatly. Silence. Holloway hesitated. This wasn't the reaction he expected. There was no shouting, no aggression, just a refusal that landed harder than defiance. Still, pride won over reason. The officer swung the crowbar without warning, cracking the passenger side mirror off the frame. Gasps followed. Someone cursed under their breath. Chuck simply lowered his gaze, not to avoid the blow, but to collect himself. "You're escalating this without cause," he said, calmly. "Your cause doesn't matter here," Holloway snapped. "Not anymore." Just then, a silver-haired woman stepped forward from the diner steps. She raised her phone. "I've got it all on video," she said, voice trembling but firm. "You're done, Brent." But Holloway wasn't listening anymore. He radioed for backup, reported non-compliance, and began cuffing Chuck as if to prove a point, not uphold a law. Chuck allowed it, not because he couldn't stop it, but because sometimes silence disarms more than resistance ever could. The murmurs in the crowd turned attention. Cameras turned on. Texts started flying. Posts started circulating. By the time the second patrol car pulled up, something had shifted, not just in the air, but in the eyes of the people watching. They weren't seeing a suspect. They were seeing a man being treated like one, for reasons that didn't add up, and the silence, it had begun to speak. The holding room was cold, deliberately so. Concrete walls, metal bench, no clock. Chuck sat without leaning back, hands still cuffed, resting quietly in his lap. He stared at a crack in the floor like it had something to say. Maybe it did. Patience speaks in silence, and Chuck had learned to listen. Down the hall, Officer Holloway was filling out a report, his pen slicing through each line like a man trying to bury a mistake before it saw daylight. Outside the station, however, daylight had already noticed. The video had gone viral before the cuffs even locked. Someone had tagged a Hashvalestone truck and posted it with a caption, "Racist cop destroys vet's car over nothing." By the time it hit its second hour online, it had over 200,000 views. By the third, a retired journalist from Tucson reposted it with a quote that landed like a hammer. "That man is not just anybody. Look closer." Meanwhile, inside the small precinct, Holloway's story began to splinter. He claimed the vehicle had unidentified military modifications and that the subject had refused to identify himself. But when Chuck's wallet was opened, clean, precise, organized, it told another story. Driver's license, expired federal clearance badge, and beneath that, a pair of old dog tags worn thin from time and sweat, stamped with a unit designation that hadn't existed on paper in over 30 years. Sergeant Charles D. Norris, Unit 32A, restricted. The clerk processing the intake, Tina Alvarez, barely 24 and just 3 weeks into the job, stared at the tag longer than she should have. Her father had served in the Gulf War. Her uncle, too. She recognized the code etched into the corner of the badge, CAG 56, a Black Ops clearance identifier. She glanced at Chuck through the glass. He wasn't demanding anything, wasn't pacing or shouting, just waiting. She slipped into the back office and made a quiet phone call. "Is this Phoenix Record Center?" A pause. "I have someone who triggered an auto flag when I entered his ID." Another pause. Then, "Hold the line." Within 20 minutes, a call came through to the sheriff's line, not from the state, but from the Federal Coordination Office in Phoenix. The voice on the other end was calm, clipped, and distinctly more formal than small-town sheriffs were used to. "We need to know if Sergeant Charles Norris is currently in your custody. Confirm now." The sheriff, Tom Whitaker, who had been fishing when the arrest was made, froze in his boots. "Chuck, Norris." "Yes, sir." Former classified liaison, U.S. Pacific Command. Cleared until 2003. Medal of Integrity recipient, declassified 2014. Is marked as a federal courtesy hold, meaning you don't hold him. Whitaker nearly dropped the phone. "Jesus." "No," the voice said, "but close enough. Release him. Now." Back at the diner, June stood by the window, arms folded tight. She'd seen enough in her life to know injustice didn't always come in with fists. Sometimes it drove a cruiser and carried a clipboard. When she saw the second squad car return, with no sirens, no urgency, and Chuck step out calmly, uncuffed, she didn't cheer. She didn't smile. She just exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for decades. Across the street, a crowd had formed. Not protesters, just watchers. People who had seen the video, read the posts, followed the links. Among them stood a high school civics teacher, a veteran who hadn't left his house in weeks, and a single mother with her baby on her hip. None of them knew Chuck personally, but now they saw him. Inside the station, Holloway stood frozen as Sheriff Whitaker read the briefing file. His face turned ashen the moment the words International Liaison, Counter Intel, and Pentagon Advisor surfaced. "Did you know who he was?" the sheriff asked quietly. Holloway stammered. He didn't say. He didn't need to say. The sheriff looked up. "You did everything wrong, and he didn't lay a finger on you." Outside, Chuck stood by his battered truck, gently retrieving the torn photo from the floorboard. He brushed off the dust, smoothed the crease, and slid it into his pocket like a man honoring something too sacred to discard. A news van turned the corner. Then another. He turned to June, who had walked across the street with a folded napkin in her hand. "Figured you might want your pie to go," she said. He chuckled softly, accepting it. "You always this calm?" she asked. "Only when I've already seen the ending," Chuck replied. Power was shifting now, not in shouts, but in silence. Holloway had tried to assert control through force. Chuck reclaimed it through restraint. And somewhere in that quiet transfer, a town began to wake up. They called it a procedural error. That's what the department statement said the next morning, printed in small black letters on the precinct website. Sergeant Charles Norris was mistakenly detained due to an administrative oversight. We regret the misunderstanding. But no one was buying that, because by then, the video had already reached national news. It aired on local Arizona channels just after the 6 o'clock report, then jumped to regional affiliates. By morning, it hit the national desk of the Veterans Advocacy Network, and that's when everything changed. A soft-spoken woman named Lila Carmichael appeared on the screen during a morning segment. She was introduced as a former intelligence analyst with the Department of Defense. Her words were measured, but heavy. That man isn't just a veteran. He was one of our quietest assets in the late 80s and early 90s. When we couldn't send cameras or uniforms, we sent people like Charles Norris. His carried secrets this country will never declassify. The fact that he was treated like this is more than a mistake. It's a warning. Within hours, the calls started flooding into Veilstone City office. Reporters, civil rights organizations, veteran support foundations. Even the governor's office issued a statement urging a full inquiry. But Chuck, he didn't issue one. He simply returned to the diner the next day, sat in the same booth, drank the same black coffee. This time, June brought him a whole slice of peach pie, unasked. "I know who you are now," she said softly. Chuck gave a faint smile. Nothing's changed. But it had. A crowd had gathered outside the diner, not with signs or chants, just presence. A kind of silent solidarity that said, "We see you now." Inside, June leaned on the counter, looking toward the window. "There's talk all over town," she said. "They said you used to be some kind of negotiator." Chuck paused. "Sometimes. Other times, I was just a guy who made sure the right people got home." And the wrong people. He looked up, learned they were wrong. Eventually, back at the precinct, Holloway sat in a windowless room, his badge placed in a sealed envelope on the desk in front of him. Sheriff Whitaker sat across from him, expression unreadable. Between them was a printed dossier, thin but heavy with implication. "You ever heard of Operation Gray Echo?" the sheriff asked. Holloway shook his head. Whitaker slid the paper forward. "Your guy was the only reason it didn't end in international disaster. He stopped a weapons deal in Jakarta in '89 that could have put the wrong tech in the wrong hands. You know how? He talked 3 men out of greed and into guilt." Holloway looked up, defensive. How was I supposed to know who he was? "That's the point," the sheriff said. "Quiet now. You didn't need to. You only needed to treat him like a person." He let that settle. "You didn't just dent a truck, son. You dented something bigger. And now we all have to answer for it." Outside, a young reporter approached Chuck in the diner's parking lot, camera off. "Mr. Norris, would you be willing to share your story? A proper interview." Chuck looked at him, not unkindly. "Stories like mine don't belong in headlines," he said. "They belong in how we treat each other. But people want to know who you are." Chuck stepped back toward his truck, now partially repaired, a temporary mirror screwed into place. "They already know who I am," he said. "I'm the man they ignored until they needed an apology." Later that evening, Chuck was invited to speak at the local community center. Not a speech, just a conversation. He agreed. What he shared wasn't classified. It wasn't even dramatic. He told them about Darrell Holt, his best friend, the man buried up on the ridge. He talked about how Darrell had taken a bullet meant for a child in Fallujah, how he died with no ceremony, no medal, and a folded flag that sat in a trailer home no one visited anymore. They forgot him, Chuck said, voice even, just like they forget so many, until we remind them. Then he paused, looked out over the crowd. "You all saw what happened out there. But what matters is what you do with it. Don't defend me. Defend the next person who isn't seen. Defend the one who doesn't have a camera, the one who's too tired to speak." The room went quiet, not out of awkwardness, but reverence. Then someone stood, then another, and another, not applauding, just standing, because some moments don't need noise to be heard. Have you ever seen someone misjudge a person so completely? Comment below. The town council met under fluorescent lights and paper-thin civility. The chamber was packed. Every seat filled, people standing in the back. Some still in work uniforms, others in Sunday clothes even though it was a Thursday. All there for the same reason. The agenda read, public comments regarding incident involving Sergeant Charles Norris. Mayor Blevins opened the floor, his hands visibly shaking. He wasn't used to crowds like this, or pressure like this. The first speaker was a woman in her 70s, cane in one hand, folded flag in the other. My husband served with dignity, came home quiet, never asked for anything. Men like Mr. Norris, they carry more than wounds. They carry silence, and you all let a man punish him for it. The room didn't cheer. They just nodded. Heavy, slow. A high school teacher followed her, then a mechanic, then the woman who recorded the video in the first place. None of them knew Chuck personally, but they knew what was right. By noon the next day, Officer Brent Holloway had been suspended without pay, pending a formal investigation. The official phrasing was misconduct during a routine traffic response. But people knew better. A group of veterans stood silently outside the station that afternoon. They didn't block doors, didn't chant, just stood, shoulder to shoulder. Some wore hats, others wore scars, but none of them needed signs. Their presence said it all. We've been watching, and we remember. Chuck never asked for a statement, never contacted a lawyer. When someone from a major network called him offering to break the story nationally, he simply replied, "The story already broke. What matters is how we patch it." Instead of interviews, he spent that week quietly helping the local body shop restore his truck. Not for free, he insisted on paying. Even offered to do some of the sanding himself. "I didn't fight for favors," he told the owner. "I fought for fairness." Meanwhile, the sheriff department issued a public letter, not a press release, but a handwritten note scanned and posted online. Sheriff Whitaker wrote it himself. To Sergeant Norris and the citizens of Veilstone, we failed, not just in our actions, but in our assumptions. We forgot that quiet dignity often walks without a badge, without backup, and without complaint. We owe more than words. We owe change. And then, quietly, they began to make it. Body cam requirements were updated. A new bias training program was adopted, designed not by state consultants, but by local community members, including veterans. Chuck was invited to help lead a monthly workshop at the station called Respect Before Rank. He agreed, but only under one condition. No cameras, no awards, just chairs and truth. One afternoon, a letter arrived at the diner, addressed to Chuck. It had no return name, just a local address. Inside was a folded piece of notebook paper. It read, "I got it wrong. I judged you, and I didn't ask who you were. I just saw what I wanted to see. I'm sorry. B.H." Chuck folded the letter once, then twice. He didn't smile, just slid it into his coat pocket without a word. Later, June asked if he believed the apology was real. "I don't measure apologies by words," Chuck said. "I measure them by what comes after." In the following weeks, the diner's parking lot filled with out-of-town cars. Folks came from other counties, some just passing through, others making quiet pilgrimages. One Vietnam vet parked next to Chuck's newly restored truck and just stood there a long while, running his hand along the polished metal. "He reminds me of my brother," the man said, voice cracked, kept his mouth shut, got treated like he didn't count. People like him, they make it home, but never feel welcomed. Chuck stood nearby, listening. He didn't interrupt, just nodded, once. Sometimes acknowledgement is the deepest form of comfort. A month after the incident, Chuck received a formal invitation in the mail. It was from the state governor's office, inviting him to a recognition ceremony. Medal of Civil Honor, prime time coverage, official photos. Chuck didn't even open the RSVP. Instead, he returned it with a handwritten note. "Respect should not be reactive. I didn't do anything new. You just finally looked." Veilstone changed. Not overnight. Not perfectly. But now, when a new face walks into the diner, the waitress greets them without pause. The patrol cars drive slower, not with suspicion, but with awareness. And the high school civics teacher added a lesson to the curriculum: the danger of assumptions. Chuck still visits the ridge every few weeks, still drives the same truck, still sits at the same booth. Only now, the town sees him, and perhaps, more importantly, they see themselves. In the weeks that followed, the story of Chuck Norris began to spread, not just as a viral clip, but as a parable. Not everyone remembered the officer's name. Not everyone remembered the town. But they remembered the look on Chuck's face as he watched his truck being destroyed. And they remembered what he didn't do. No shouting, no rage, no revenge, just quiet accountability. One night, the local radio station held a call-in segment titled "Who's the Quiet Hero in Your Life?" They'd invited Chuck to come on the air. He politely declined, but he did leave a small handwritten note for the host. A hero doesn't need to be known, just remembered when it counts. That night, they read it live between callers. A young man spoke about his grandfather who never talked about career but taught him how to shake a hand properly. A middle-aged woman broke down recalling a janitor at her high school who stood up for her when no one else did. Every caller circled back to the same idea. Respect should be given before someone has to prove they deserve it. At the diner, June taped a printed photo behind the register, a still frame from the viral video, where Chuck stands beside his wrecked truck, hands folded calmly in front of him. Below it, a small handwritten sign reads, "Character is how you stand when no one stands with you." People began to stop in just to see it. Not for the photo, for what it reminded them of. Across town, the civics teacher, Mr. Holman, launched a new senior class project called The Unseen. Students were assigned to interview people in the community who'd been overlooked, dismissed, or misjudged. The project unearthed stories that had never been told. A native elder who'd been denied housing for years. A bus driver who saved 2 kids from an accident and never told anyone. A former nurse who sat with dying patients when families wouldn't come. When the final presentations were given, Holman invited Chuck to attend. He didn't sit up front. He stood in the back, arms crossed, eyes steady. And when a student mentioned his name during their speech, just like what happened to Mr. Norris, the room turned toward him, quietly. Chuck just tipped his head and kept listening. The most meaningful reflection didn't come from a podium or a news anchor or a politician. It came in the form of a small, spiral-bound notebook placed carefully on Chuck's table at the diner one morning. June said it had been dropped off by a young woman. No name, just a message on the first page. "You reminded my father who he used to be. He started speaking again after watching your story. I haven't heard him tell a memory in 10 years. Thank you." The rest of the notebook was filled with short notes from strangers. Some simple, some emotional, all honest. "You didn't flinch. That changed me. I show my kids your video before they leave the house. I thought staying quiet was weakness. You proved me wrong." Chuck read every one. Didn't say much about it, but he kept the notebook in his glove compartment from that day on. Truth is a way of echoing, not loudly, but deeply. Chuck's story became a touchstone, not because he fought back, but because he stood still when it mattered most, because he waited when the world demanded reaction, because he acted with dignity when he could have chosen anything else. And in that stillness, others found their voice. The sun was just starting to lower over the ridge when Chuck tightened the last strap on the back of his truck. The new mirror gleamed, the body clean and straight again. But he hadn't buffed out all the scratches. A few marks remained, intentionally, not as damage, as reminders. He paused before getting in. The diner lights flickered on behind him. Inside, June watched from the window, dish towel in hand. She didn't wave. She knew he wasn't the waving type. Chuck looked out toward the horizon, flat and golden, no end in sight, just the way he liked it. Then, slowly, he opened the truck door and climbed in. On the dash sat the notebook full of notes from strangers, the folded apology letter, the photo of Darryl, taped back in place with a new corner crease, but still upright, still looking forward. He started the engine. It didn't roar. It hummed, like a man who didn't need to prove he was alive, just needed to keep moving. As the truck pulled away, a small boy standing with his mother on the sidewalk lifted his hand in a salute. Not playfully, not for show. Chuck saw him, and nodded, Just once. Then he was gone, dust trailing behind him like a memory you don't chase, but carry. The screen faded to black, and in the silence that followed, a single line appeared. Strength isn't how loud you speak. It's how steady you stay. A moment later, another. If this story moved you, share it. Let dignity travel farther than hate. Thank you for walking this road with Chuck.